The valley was not on any map. Those who claimed to find it said the air grew heavy long before the first cabin came into view, as if the land itself wanted to keep its secrets buried. There, beneath the twisted oaks and blackened pines, life had followed its own laws older than scripture, darker than sin. They said a girl once lived there, a bride before she could spell her own name. Her skin was pale as candle wax, her hair the color of ash, and her eyes, cold, unblinking, carried the weight of generations born from the same blood. She did not choose her fate, it was chosen for her the moment she drew her first breath in that crooked cabin at the edge of the woods. The whispers began after her wedding night, the one that wasn't supposed to happen. The ceremony took place in the dead of winter, inside a church that hadn't heard a prayer in 50 years. No one came from outside the valley. No one dared. The child stood there in a lace dress too big for her body, the sleeves dragging through the dirt floor, while her family watched with hollow eyes, as if they'd done this many times before. When dawn came, the valley was quiet again. The smoke from the chimneys curled into the grey sky like ghosts taking flight. And in the farmhouse on the hill, a girl lay beside a man she called kin. Somewhere, a clock stopped ticking and never started again. The Forbidden Valley was a place time refused to touch. Hidden deep within the folds of the Appalachian Mountains, it existed like a wound the earth had tried to forget. The world outside moved on, building roads, cities, and railways, but the valley remained still, cocooned in mist and silence. To reach it, one had to follow a trail no map dared to mark, a path that wound between crooked trees and cliffs so steep even sunlight hesitated to fall there. Travelers who stumbled upon it spoke of a strange stillness in the air, a quiet that made their skin prickle, as though the land itself was listening. The soil was dark, rich with decay, and the trees stood too close together, their roots entwined like the bloodlines of the people who called the valley home. Generations had lived and died there without stepping beyond its boundaries. Outsiders were not welcomed, they were watched from behind cracked windows and rusted fences until they left, usually before nightfall. The valley folk spoke in whispers, their voices slow and drawn out, their words heavy with superstition. They believed the outside world was cursed with lies and greed, while theirs was pure, protected by the old ways that had guided their ancestors for centuries. But purity, in their eyes, was not about faith or virtue. It was about blood. Theirs was a bloodline unbroken, a lineage preserved with devotion that bordered on madness. They married within, always within, ensuring the names in their family Bible stayed the same for generations. Those who were born there often carried a look, pale eyes, sunken cheeks, a certain fragile stillness in their movements, as if shaped by the valley's own gloom. The few doctors who ever ventured close whispered about strange birth defects, about children who spoke too late or not at all, about faces that resembled one another too closely to be chance. But the valley didn't need doctors, it had its own healers, women who brewed tonics from roots and bones and spoke to the dead as easily as the living. The people trusted them more than any outsider. On nights when the wind was right, those living on the mountain's edge claimed they could hear faint singing old hymns carried through the trees, voices rising and falling like a funeral dirge. Some said it was the sound of worship. Others said it was mourning. And deep inside that valley, beyond the reach of the world's light, a family waited for their next generation to be born, believing that to mix blood was to invite ruin, and to keep it pure was to stay chosen, even if that choice meant eternal darkness. She was born on a night when the mountains held their breath. The storm outside clawed at the roof, thunder rolling like an angry spirit trapped in the clouds, yet inside the cabin, everything was still. The air smelled of kerosene and damp wood, the only light coming from a trembling candle set on the floor beside a rusted bed frame. Her mother lay on the thin mattress, clutching a worn quilt as sweat streaked down her temples. The old midwife, her own aunt, murmured prayers under her breath, words not found in any holy book, words that belonged to the valley alone. When the baby's cry finally broke through the night, it didn't sound like joy. It was small and sharp, a sound that cut through the silence and then quickly faded, as if the child already understood she was not meant to be heard. The mother turned her face toward the wall, unable to look at her newborn. She knew what the child was, what she herself had done, but in the valley, shame was not spoken. The father waited outside, smoking a pipe beneath the porch. He was silent, his face unreadable. He was her father too, though no one dared to name that truth aloud. The family called it the way of blood, the old rule that bound them to their ancestors. They said it was God's will to keep the line strong, untouched by outsiders who would poison it. But in that cabin, as the candle guttered and the wind moaned through the cracks, the truth hung heavier than the air. The baby's eyes opened before dawn, wide and grey like stormwater. The midwife said they looked too knowing, too calm for a child just born. She wrapped her in a faded sheet and whispered a blessing that was more warning than prayer. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the ground still trembled with the memory of thunder. The mother drifted into sleep, and the midwife carried the baby to the window. The mountains loomed like dark sentinels, their peaks swallowed by fog. "You'll never leave here," she whispered to the child, pressing her lips to the tiny forehead. "You belong to this land, same as the rest." By morning, the storm had passed, but the air carried a strange chill that lingered for days. The family buried the afterbirth near the roots of an old oak behind the house, as was their custom, a sign that the child's life was bound to the valley's soil. No birth certificate, no doctor, no witness beyond the trees and the wind. Outside the valley, she did not exist. Inside it, she was destiny fulfilled, the continuation of a curse disguised as tradition, born in silence, fated to remain there forever. Long before the girl was born, the valley had been ruled by its elders, grey men and hollow-eyed women who believed their blood was sacred. They were the keepers of the old pact, an agreement whispered into existence when the first settlers built their cabins between the ridges. The world outside, they said, was tainted. Cities bred sin, strangers brought disease, and the touch of an outsider's hand could undo what their ancestors had built. So they created their own law, carved not on paper but in flesh. The bloodline must remain pure. Every marriage, every birth, every union was to be arranged under the watch of the council, ensuring that no foreign name would ever stain their lineage. The pact of the elders was never written down, but everyone in the valley knew its rules by heart. It was passed through stories told around dying fires, through sermons given in barns where crosses hung crooked and dust danced in the sunlight. Purity is strength, they said. Purity is survival. To question it was to betray the land itself. Children were raised to see outsiders as a threat, a danger to the sacred chain that bound them to their ancestors. Those who tried to leave were never spoken of again, their names were scratched out from family Bibles, their graves left unmarked. The valley consumed its own, feeding on loyalty and fear. When the elders gathered, it was always after dark. They met in the oldest cabin, the one with the stone chimney and walls blackened by years of firelight. Inside, the air smelled of smoke, candle wax, and damp earth. The men would sit in a circle, their faces half-lit, their shadows stretching across the floor like branches. The women stood behind them, silent, their hands clasped tightly as prayers were muttered. The decisions made in that room shaped generations. Who would marry whom, which families would join, who would bear the next child destined to keep the bloodline unbroken, all determined in whispers no one dared to challenge. It was said that the pact had kept them safe when famine struck and when soldiers marched through the mountains during the war. They believed their isolation was protection, that their unity was proof of divine favor. But beneath that belief ran something darker, a quiet decay that no one named. The faces began to look too familiar, the children too similar, the minds slower, the bodies frailer. Still, the elders refused to see the truth. To them, it was not corruption, it was holiness. And so the cycle continued, a sacred ritual bound by ignorance and fear, each generation believing they were preserving their legacy when, in truth, they were burying it deeper into the valley's cursed soil. When she turned 9, the whispers began. The women who came to fetch water from the creek spoke softly, their eyes avoiding the girl's face, their words slipping through the wind like something half forbidden. She was different, they said. Chosen. The child herself didn't understand what it meant, only that her mother grew quieter each day and her father stopped looking at her altogether. The nights grew longer that summer, and the valley air felt heavy, as if even the trees knew what was coming. Then, one evening, the elders arrived. Their shadows stretched long against the cabin walls, their faces carved from the same hard silence that ruled the mountains. They sat her down, smoothed her hair, and told her she was to be married before the next full moon. The girl's cousin was a man in his 20s, tall, with hollow cheeks and eyes that flickered with something both familiar and strange. He had been chosen by the council, they said, because his blood matched hers perfectly. There was no love to it, no ceremony of choice or hope. It was duty, a binding, a way to keep the valley's purity alive. Her mother wept silently, though she tried to hide it. Her father stared at the fire, pipe clenched in his teeth, saying nothing. The girl didn't cry. She had been taught that tears were weakness, and weakness was sin. The preparations began in secret. A white dress was taken from a cedar chest, yellowed by time, its lace fraying at the edges. It had belonged to her grandmother, who had been wed at nearly the same age. The midwife adjusted it with shaking hands, muttering prayers in the old tongue. The girl stood still, watching her reflection in a piece of cracked glass. She thought she looked like a ghost, her small frame swallowed by fabric meant for a woman long dead. Each day that passed drew her closer to the ceremony. The valley seemed to close in around her, the hills pressing tighter, the forest whispering things she didn't want to hear. She saw her cousin watching her from across the fields, his expression unreadable, as if even he didn't want what had been decided for them. But the elder's word was law. To disobey would be to defy blood itself, to curse the family, to invite death. So, when the night came and the moon rose pale and distant over the mountains, she walked barefoot to the old church, her dress dragging through the dirt. She didn't look back. The valley demanded obedience, and she, barely a child, was to become its bride. The night of the ceremony came without warning, swallowed in fog so thick it seemed the mountains themselves wanted to hide what was about to happen. The church sat crooked at the valley's edge, its steeple leaning like a dying tree. No bell had rung there in 50 years, and the wooden doors groaned when the family pushed them open. Inside, the air was heavy with dust and rot, the smell of damp earth seeping through the cracks in the floor. The pews were empty, except for a few candle stubs flickering weakly on the altar. There was no priest, only the eldest of the council, a man whose eyes had gone blind long ago but who claimed he could still see the truth through faith. The girl was led down the aisle by her mother, her bare feet leaving small prints in the dirt. The dress hung loose on her shoulders, trailing behind her like a shroud. The lace veil, yellowed and torn, covered most of her face. She could hear the murmurs of the gathered family, voices low and strange, repeating words she didn't understand. Her cousin stood waiting at the front, his hands trembling, his face pale in the candlelight. He avoided her eyes. The old man began the ritual, his voice rasping like wind through dry leaves. It wasn't a blessing he spoke but a chant, something older than the church itself, something the valley had kept alive long after the world forgot it. The candles flickered harder when the vows were said. There were no rings, no music, only the echo of their words and the soft sob of her mother trying not to be heard. The girl didn't cry. She didn't even blink. The elders had told her this was her destiny, that the blood of the valley was sacred and she was its vessel. She repeated the words they had taught her, her small voice echoing through the hollow building, and when it was done, the old man pressed her hand into her cousin's and declared them bound by flesh and faith. When they stepped outside, the fog had thickened, curling around the trees like smoke. The moon was hidden, and the air felt too still. The family dispersed without a word, vanishing into the mist. The bride and groom walked back to the farmhouse together, their shadows stretching across the wet ground. Somewhere in the woods, an owl cried out, its call echoing through the valley like a warning no one would heed. Inside the house, a single lamp burned. The door closed behind them, and the silence that followed felt like the world had stopped breathing. The farmhouse sat at the top of a winding dirt path, half hidden by overgrown weeds and the skeletons of trees that had long stopped bearing fruit. It had stood there for generations, its foundation sinking deeper into the earth with each passing decade. The windows were clouded with grime, the paint on the walls flaking away like old skin, and the front porch sagged under the weight of time. To anyone passing by, it looked abandoned, but for the girl, it became home the night she was taken there as a bride. The moment she stepped through the door, she felt the air change, thick, stale, and cold even though the fire was burning. Every sound seemed to echo too long, every shadow lingered where it shouldn't. The first thing she noticed were the portraits. They hung in every room, faded photographs and oil paintings of faces that looked disturbingly alike. Men with the same narrow eyes, women with the same thin lips, children staring forward with empty gazes. Some were cracked, their glass frames spiderwebbed with age, but the eyes always seemed clear, as if the ancestors were still watching from beyond the veil of dust. Her husband told her their names in a low voice, pointing one by one, his finger trembling slightly. She didn't remember them all, but she felt their presence like a weight pressing against her chest. At night, the house made sounds that kept her awake. The floors creaked even when no one walked on them. Doors shuddered in their frames though the air outside was still. Sometimes she thought she heard footsteps on the stairs, slow and deliberate, stopping just before her door. Her husband slept soundly beside her, his breathing steady, as if he had learned to live with the noise long ago. When she told him what she heard, he only said, "It's the old ones. They never really leave." Days passed in silence. The girl wandered the halls, tracing her fingers along the wallpaper that peeled in long strips, revealing wood darkened by years of smoke and sorrow. In the kitchen, a cracked window let in a thin line of sunlight that never seemed to warm the room. The only sign of life came from the clock in the hallway, its tick slow and uneven, as though time itself struggled to move within those walls. Each evening, when dusk fell and the mountains turned black against the sky, the portraits seemed to come alive. The girl could feel their gaze following her every step, watching, judging, waiting for her to fulfill whatever role the valley had carved for her. In that house, she was not alone, and yet she had never felt more trapped. As the seasons turned, the girl grew older in years but not in body. Her face remained unchanged, her limbs thin and fragile, her skin pale as winter fog. The people of the valley began to whisper again, this time with fear instead of reverence. They said she was touched by something unholy, that her blood had turned against her. No child came from her womb despite the passing years, and her husband grew quieter, his eyes dull with confusion and shame. In a place where birth was proof of purity, her emptiness was seen as a curse. The elders came to the farmhouse more than once, their voices low and stern, demanding to know if she had sinned or angered the ancestors. She would only shake her head, her expression calm, her silence more unsettling than any answer. The valley had always believed that their blood was a blessing, a gift that made them chosen. But in her, that belief began to unravel. The women who once envied her for being the chosen bride now crossed themselves when she passed, whispering that her body had frozen in time because of what she was born from. Children stared at her in secret, calling her the girl who doesn't grow. Some nights, she could hear their laughter echoing outside the farmhouse, fading into the wind as if carried by ghosts. Inside, the mirrors were covered. Her husband said it was for modesty, but she knew better. He couldn't bear to see her reflection, the same small, pale figure he had married when she was still a child. He had aged, his face lined and weary, yet she remained the same. Sometimes she would stand in front of the covered glass, her hands pressed against the fabric, wondering if she would still see herself if she dared to look. She began to dream of the ancestors in the portraits, their eyes following her through the halls, their whispers seeping into her mind like roots through soil. They told her she was the last of them, the one who carried the final strain of their blood, and that when she died, the valley would die too. The midwife came once to see her, the same woman who had delivered her into the world. She took one look at the girl and turned pale, muttering that she had seen such stillness only in the dead. The girl smiled faintly, as if she already knew. In the valley, where time itself seemed to circle upon the same sins, she had become something neither living nor lost, a reminder of what happens when purity becomes poison and blood turns to silence. It was late summer when the outsider came to the valley, a stranger with a clipboard and a government badge, sent to count the living in places the rest of the country had forgotten. He was a young census worker, curious and polite, unaware that some places were never meant to be found. The map he carried showed only blank green where the valley lay, but he followed the dirt roads anyway, tracing the rumors of old families who lived without law or light. The moment he crossed the ridge, the air seemed to thicken, and the forest grew unnaturally quiet. The birds stopped singing. The only sound was the low hum of insects and the steady crunch of his boots on the path. When he reached the first house, he noticed the windows were covered with boards and the chimneys released no smoke, though the air was cool. Faces appeared behind curtains, pale, expressionless, watching him with the suspicion of generations taught to fear the outside world. The man introduced himself, but no one spoke. Finally, an old man pointed down the road and said only one thing: "You'll want the house on the hill." The tone was not invitation but warning. Still, the census worker continued. He felt something drawing him forward, a mixture of duty and unease, as if the valley itself wanted him to see what it hid. By the time he reached the farmhouse, dusk had begun to fall. The light dimmed to a bruised purple, and the trees cast long shadows that moved like living things. The girl stood in the doorway, small and still, her eyes the same color as the fading sky. She looked no older than 15, though something in her face carried the weight of many years. The man greeted her kindly, asking her name, her age, her husband's name, but her replies came slow, uncertain, as if she had to dig through layers of memory to find them. Behind her, the portraits on the wall caught his attention, faces identical to hers, generations deep, each staring back with the same hollow calm. He asked if her parents were home, and she simply said, "They're here," without turning her head. When he pressed further, a strange stillness fell over the house. The air felt colder. From somewhere upstairs came a faint creak, then silence. He made notes on his paper, pretending not to notice the smell of earth and something faintly metallic that hung in the air. Before leaving, he promised to return with supplies, but the girl only stared, her lips parting just enough to whisper, "You shouldn't." As he walked back down the hill, the woods seemed to close behind him, erasing his path, and the valley watched, quiet, patient, waiting. The outsider never made it back to town. His report was never filed, his supplies never fetched, and his car was found weeks later at the base of the mountain, doors open, keys still in the ignition, as if he had simply stepped out and vanished into the trees. The sheriff from the nearest county led a search party up the ridge, but few of his men were willing to go far. The locals warned them about the valley, saying it wasn't on any map for a reason, that strange things happened to those who crossed into its shadow. For 3 days, the searchers called his name through the forest, their voices swallowed by fog. They found footprints that led down an unmarked trail but stopped suddenly near the creek, where the water ran dark and slow. Some said they saw shapes moving under the surface, but when they reached in, their hands touched only cold stones and silt. Over the years, roads were built around the mountains, maps redrawn to erase the valley completely, but the locals still warned strangers not to wander too deep. They said the curse never died, only waited. And every generation or so, when the fog thickened and the river ran high, someone new would vanish near the old path, drawn by the same quiet pull. Those who believed said it was her, the bride who never grew, the child who never escaped, still calling from the shadows, her voice soft and endless, humming the song of the valley that would never let her rest.